without miracles. He will provide himself with a miracle of his own making. He will believe in any kind of deity, even though he may otherwise be a heretic, an atheist, and a rebel.
Good. Okay, well, without further ado, I think we're probably online. Let's kick off. What's up, everybody? How the hell are all of you people? It's so lovely to, well, not to see you or to hear you, but to speak at you again. I'm here for a very special edition of the Heretics podcast show, which has been off for a while. And in the absence of content, we knew we had to do something. And we thought, what better way than to do something a little bit different? So today's episode will have a slightly different focus while staying true to the original Heretics special theme. And I'm very, very pleased to welcome today Jake Sanders, my brother Jake Sanders. Jake, how are you?
Yeah, I'm good, thank you. Hello, everyone. It's great to be a sort of securing our place in the Guinness World Records for the world's first film podcast.
It's about time someone crossed the Rubicon and did a podcast about movies.
Yeah,
that's very true.
Could we be on something?
Yeah, yeah. Jake, hopefully you'll be lucky enough to see both of us in full high definition video today, possibly if we get around to it. So that'd be nice as well. If you can't tell, Jake, by both his surname and his eyebrow configuration, is related to me in the way of being my brother. And there's a particular reason that Jake is on with us today. Jake, maybe do you want to give us a bit of an introduction about kind of what you're all about?
Yeah, sure. So I am a film writer. Well, not a film writer. I write about film and programmer. Although I haven't done much of that recently due to the pandemic. I work for something called Deeper Into Movies, who is like a underground film screening initiative based in London. And yeah, when Tom came to me with the idea of doing a podcast about film Heretics, I pitched a few ideas, and somewhat to my dismay, I did sort of feel your pulse quicken as I started describing the world of Zahler, and I sensed I was going to have to come on and talk about sort of the one of the more kind of provocative and genuinely kind of outsider film directors making films in the sort of current climate. So here we are. I've got plenty of notes ready to talk about. Yeah,
he's not joking, guys. He's got binders full of Zahler. He's come stacked to the gills. He's been standing outside a building in London taking photos of people coming and going for a while. He's been connecting bits of coloured thread. So I think maybe just to clarify, even before we jump in terms of what the podcast is, obviously we do have a kind of Oxford focus, and the original concept was behind kind of people from Oxford academic disciplines. In this case, what we're doing is, I think, taking a slight left turn and looking at one specific filmmaker and sort of the ways in which his movie making can be read as heretical, and the concept of hereticism sort of in the film industry and what it means for people in today's climate, and hopefully also getting some good discussion about what I think we both agree are some quite good films as well, right?
For sure, yeah. I mean, I have issues with the three films. It's unusual for me to have a sort of like a moral sort of quandary with a film which comes out these days, which is unusual, I think, because most of my issues with films are kind of aesthetic, whereas I think that Zahler does raise some sort of interesting, trickier questions than are typically being raised in films at the moment. But overall, I would say I enjoy all three films, some more than others, but we'll get to that.
So maybe a bit of introduction as to what the hell we're talking about. I mean, I'd be curious to see what population of the Heretics listenership knows one of the movies by name, knows who Zahler is. I certainly didn't. I had heard the names dragged across concrete and Bone Tomahawk before, because they do tend to stick in your mind a little bit. I mean, there's something fairly audacious just about calling a movie Dragged Across Concrete. It's certainly a very evocative title. But it was only after Jake sort of suggested this theme that I watched all three movies, which for me was a semi-mild achievement, actually, to have watched three movies in a few weeks, and began to see the sort of threads connecting the whole thing together. So maybe, Jake, a quick introduction to who Zahler is and why anyone should sort of care about him.
Yeah, so Zahler is a writer, director, heavy metal musician, and novelist who, he's 46 and he's been kind of grinding in the industry for several decades, which I think does inform his films a little bit. he sold scripts to places like Warner Brothers and HBO, but wasn't able to get any of them made until Bone Tomahawk in 2014, which was produced by a company called Sinister, who have sort of positioned themselves as like an outsider Texas-based studio. And because of the kind of provocative and often problematic nature of the films, he has kind of conjured this outsider reputation, which he's contributed to by these sort of prickly interviews where he refuses to kind of discuss the politics or values at play in his work. And this kind of reached its apex, I think, with the casting of Mel Gibson in Dragged Across Concrete, which is a film that, at least on one level, is about police brutality in modern America.
Absolutely, and so I think it's worth dwelling for a second on Zahler because I found the research absolutely fascinating. And before we start talking about the films, Zahler himself. So Zahler wrote, I think he worked as a chef, was it, for 10 years, and in that time he wrote something like I think he said he wrote 5 westerns, and then Bone Tomahawk was the first one that got picked up. So this man has written like 2 western fantasy novels. He has a semi-established, what I'd call kind of trad heavy metal band called Realmbuilder, which we might talk about a little bit later on. He wrote just enormous, prodigious numbers of scripts, and Bone Tomahawk was the one that finally sort of got the attention of studios, and someone actually decided to make it. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, I think one thing that is worth noting with Zahler is he does talk about how quickly he writes. He says it takes him about a month to write a film, 6 weeks to write a novel. So I do think perhaps there is a quantity over quality with some of this stuff, but the fact that the output that we've seen is perhaps a bit slimmer makes it seem as if he's kind of been working towards these films his entire life. Whereas I think that there's something to do with the kind of the rapidity with which these is that a word? Rapidity? Speed?
Sure.
Yeah, with which
which
these films are written, which maybe contributes to their kind of imperfect or perhaps slightly like shaggy nature. But yeah,
I mean, I think he seems to include everything that he would find interesting about a movie like that, right? He doesn't seem to be particularly keen of cutting the fat, especially. And whether that's an artistic, go on.
So I mean, the feedback that everyone apparently had on the Bone Tomahawk script was this does not need to be 2 hours 20 minutes, but Zahler insisted that it did, which is why you have the sort of these long digressions of sort of meandering conversations when you could be getting to the action much quicker, and that's sort of a hallmark of Zahler's films is these like protracted sequences, long conversations, which serve to build atmosphere, but which a lot of other studios might be like, you need to cut this.
That's interesting because I think one of the more specious and less interesting comparisons with Zahler's work we could make is Tarantino. I think that would be a knee-jerk one because I mean, let's be honest, they're violent movies and they have these these famous Pulp Fiction-esque digressive scenes where the characters talk about the struggles they're going through or their favorite diner or whatever, or stuff that doesn't seem directly related to the plot, and that's interspersed by brief periods of horrific violence. But I don't think Tarantino probably is the most useful comparison we could be making with Zahler, right?
I think that the thing with the Tarantino comparison is that they're both obviously directors who are drawing directly from their influences. But I think the thing with Tarantino is that, like, at Tarantino's worst, he's essentially just lifting wholesale from films and sort of intelligently stitching them together. Whereas one thing that you can't really deny with Zahler is that although, he's obviously influenced by people like Sam Peckinpah and Don Siegel, he is filtering all of these films through a very specific worldview, which makes his films feel distinct from the things that he's paying homage to. So, for example, like Kill Bill is directly lifting from the Lady Snowblood films to the point where he was even having sort of the cast and crew watch it during the production. Whereas I think with Zahler's films, it's like, tonally and thematically they have some similarities to films like Bring Me the Head of Alfredo Garcia or Dirty Harry, but he is grounding them in a much more contemporary context. And I do think that Zahler's kind of unique worldview, which he doesn't really want to discuss that much, is something that really comes through in his films in a way that Tarantino's like boyish recreation of the things he likes doesn't quite do the same thing for me.
I think you're getting towards the heart of the point, really, in the trying to find a coherent ideology in Tarantino's kind of conception of the world through his films. I think is going to be very hard because I don't think he is particularly interested in I don't want to say human nature, but in a sort of conception of reality, so much as he is in this sort of highlight reel of interesting things happening and of reference to and pastiches of and influences from other movies, where Zahler seems to pick genres that resonate with him. And as you say, I mean, in a way, he's almost a pure artist in that he'll read a bunch of stuff or observe a bunch of stuff that he likes and say, I'm going to make this. And then when he makes it, it's filtered through his mechanical process to produce what he thinks is a movie that should be. So Bone Tomahawk is his take on the Western, and it has all these Western traits and Western features, but it has some specific Zahlerisms, which we'll come to, which is stuff like perhaps the racial overtones, stuff like the hyper-violence and the vivisection, and also a kind of Manichean conception of good and evil, which arguably is a Western trope, but it's all very Zahler, isn't it, from top to bottom? And
Sure.
Before I let you talk again, I wanted to also talk about the time he takes for his movies. I mean, as a metal fan, listening to Realmbuilder, his metal band, has songs like, Advance of the War Giants, which are 15 minutes long. And that's the style of a lot of those metal songs, is just like, it's for fans. So it's for people who like 15-minute songs, and fuck you, I'm going to make it 15 minutes long,
Sure. I mean, that was one thing which Zahler says is like the reason he picks the titles in the way that he does is like, there's only a certain number of people who are going to see Bone Tomahawk, a film called Bone Tomahawk. And he says 60% will like it, 20% won't like it because they'll find it offensive, and 20% will find it boring. So, he's making it with a sort of specific group of people in mind, who are people who probably enjoy the same kind of things that he does. But interestingly, Bone Tomahawk is an interesting example because I think the Bone Tomahawk is the one which is most derivative in a way, or at least the most like reflexive of film history, because it's basically a remake of John Ford's The Searchers, which is a film about this posse of white guys trying to rescue these women from the sort of the clutches of the Native Americans. And the subtext of the film is that it's all about this like sexual anxiety and fear of like these women being trapped in sexual bondage. And it's all sort of coded in the racism of these guys feel towards the Native Americans. So, Bone Tomahawk, although the idea of these like cannibal natives, whatever, is an extremely like quote unquote problematic trope to include in the film, he's arguably just kind of satirizing the hysterical depiction of Native Americans in Western history in the same way that the Coen brothers did in something like The Ballad of Buster Scruggs. And in that sense, he's giving his audience like a certain degree of credit to understand that he's like satirizing these things, while also, opening himself up to criticism of being just sort of outwardly, racist or ignorant. Right. So,
and this is exactly the line that he's treading on, because saying that it's a satire of the Western depiction of the other as a bunch of face-painted, cannibalistic Native Americans is all well and good, but unfortunately, the fact is that it's a movie about four white men with moral, with self-professed moral authority, saving a white woman from the clutches of a bunch of subhuman Native Americans. I mean, that's on the face of it what the movie is, and the inclusion of stuff like a sympathetic Native American character who you meet earlier, who says, "Oh well, we're not all cannibalistic, ritualistic Satanist monsters."
Is comically like,
is perhaps, I think, one of Zahler's main errors, and one of the things that some reviewers have really chewed him out over on Dragged Across Concrete. The gesturing, so obviously by having black characters, African American characters, you have one of the two cops in Dragged Across Concrete has an African American wife, and the depiction of the struggles of their life is sort of I don't want to say played lip service to, but it's certainly mentioned. But I mean, do you not think that perhaps that is the key with Zahler's film? One of the key issues is how far are we to interpret this as a nodding wink to the genre tropes of old, and how far is this a man making a movie about four white people killing Native Americans?
Yeah, I think that that Zahler, my biggest sort of criticism with Zahler is that he kind of blithely presents like both sides and then mistakes that for complexity. And I think, one thing that's interesting is that although Zahler is positioned as this, complete outsider in terms of not making films sort of for prestige or for critical respect, he seems to be in kind of constant conversation with his critics. And so, for example, in Brawl and Cell Block 99, people accuse that film of being racist or in sort of, or playing on kind of like, racial anxieties to sort of target a certain audience. And Zahler in interviews seems to concede that he understands how people can think that. And he says he thinks that's because it only has a single perspective in the film. And so for Dragged Across Concrete, he's like, okay, well, we'll include multiple perspectives from sort of, you know, not just from the white cops, but from black characters, and that will, you know, that will sort of form a buffer against which, you know, he can sort of defend his film. But I think what's obvious though is that, you know, the Tory Kittle's character Henry Johns is just not characterized with the same complexity or degree of sympathy, really, that the Vince Vaughn and Mel Gibson characters are. I mean, it's much more one note, and worse, I think Zahler layers on sort of plot aspects to sort of engender sympathy with the character in a way that starts to feel very, very forced. Like a disabled brother, a mom who's turned to prostitution.
Yeah.
He went to prison for the right reason. You know, it's like, you know, in a way
indeed.
that I think is different to the kind of the much murkier complexity that you get with the Gibson and Vaughn characters.
I think this is what's so interesting about it, and then I think it was the New York Times article you linked me today that made those accusations. I think about as well as they can be made is that, you know, if you're trying to accuse someone of racism and they're saying I'm not racist, and then the next day you see them they're wearing a kind of Wu-Tang Clan t-shirt or something, I as a poor example, that sort of performative, whatever you want to call it, performative wokeness or performative inclusion is one of the worst things you can do to sort of drag yourself into the level of the discourse. And because the thing for me is when I watched Drag Across Country, I mean, I thought that the two African American characters were obviously meant as a foil and a compliment to the two racist cops, and they were intelligent, they were articulate, maybe even a bit too articulate at points. Like he almost seemed to want to write them with deliberately high levels of articulation, so as to kind of, you know, step back from that. And you also have these kind of pure evil, you know, kind of classic 80s European baddies of this guy who's like,
they were the big
of despair. Yeah, exactly. Just these kind of omni-European, hyper efficient Germanic killers who, you know, sort of transit. Well, they're the really bad guys, right? So everyone else is just doing their best to exist. So Zahler's sort of backed himself into a corner, and the more kind of gesturing he does towards that side of things, the more they seem to take that as an interpretation of his own guilt. Whereas if he just made the movies unapologetically as they are, perhaps that would be more generously interpreted, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, I know what you mean in terms of the fact that they are like sympathetically characterized. But for example, like Michael J. White, who plays Biscuit, who is Henry's friend in the film. I mean, Michael J. White like is a pretty like famous actor. Like he was in like Black Dynamite and like has a sort of cult following, and yet his character is so flat. They have the one monologue about like the birthday party, which is like, you know, I don't actually think that Zahler is an sentimental writer, but I mean, but that scene is like much less subtle than the way that he kind of builds the character with between Vaughn and Gibson in terms of like those sort of long conversations and the stakeouts, and, you know, showing this kind of like this strange intimacy that they've obviously built over the years in a way that, you know, he basically just has like one monologue to kind of give you a full history of these two characters. And it's like, you know, the film's almost 3 hours long. I mean, he could surely have balanced it a bit more and made it a bit more interesting. And even the ending, I mean, because the way that the film ends, obviously, with the Tory Kittle's character kind of victorious. But, you know, the decision to have him honor his promise to Gibson's character does seem slightly antithetical to the, like, you know, the
bleak moral universe,
the
ruthless moral universe that they otherwise inhabit, right?
Yeah, and he has this whole thing, you know, with the hunters and the lions and stuff like that, which seems to be saying like it's every man for himself out there, which I think is something which is a through line through Zahler's films. And so to have this thing where it's like, you know, he sends the gold to Gibson's family, it's like, well, why? The guy, like, indeed. I mean, like, you know, it's just, I'm not sure that like it completely like rings true for me. And that to me seems like Zahler trying to work against his critics, basically, in a way that, you know, is less interesting to me than the more kind of like brazen aspects of like Brawl and Cell Block 99, for example.
So I agree. I think Zahler's response to this is I write characters and I put the characters into situations and I see what they do. And what I like about the movies is that I do buy the characters who are often very well acted, and their cynical, racist, jaded, wisecracking review on humanity I see as completely believable, and I see as completely like realistic, and the conversations they have about race and also, you know, the way that they perform almost their racism to each other a lot of the times in Cell Block 99 as a sort of way of bonding on the force and like that. I mean, that all makes sense to me. But if you're going to have a kind of thesis, which is, well, they're real characters, they act in realistic ways, then I don't think that particular action at the end of that movie rung true for me. and that tends to scupper a lot of what's been discussed. So I think would we both agree that Dragged Across Concrete has sort of is the most controversial and of the movies, partly because it deals explicitly with issues of American racism and police brutality. I mean, maybe could you quickly explain perhaps like the real touch points that people have sort of pushed back in terms of the casting, in terms of the content, and in terms of why that particular movie has been seen as problematic?
Yeah, sure. I mean, the big reason is that Mel Gibson is casting it playing a police officer who him and his partner, played by Vince Vaughn, are videotaped brutalizing a guy on a fire escape, and the video is leaked to the press, and so they get suspended. And during this time, they decide they have to stage this heist so they can earn some money, and Gibson can move out of his neighborhood where his daughter is being bullied by sort of local black teenagers. I mean, obviously, yeah, the casting of Gibson was a big reason for that. Although, what is noteworthy is that Gibson directed a film in 2016 called Hacksaw Ridge, which was like a huge awards contender. And was like, had loads of big actors and had a huge budget. So it's like, Zahler puts Gibson front and center in a way that I think is different to the more kind of hypocritical way that Gibson has been embraced by the Hollywood mainstream, who are, in some ways like celebrating Gibson's comeback, but like doing it with, under the guise of like the prestige Hollywood picture. Whereas I think that, Zahler is, at least in his eyes, I think he's forcing you to kind of like confront your relationship with Gibson, the man in the film, specifically in the scene where they have the meeting with Don Johnson, which I don't know what you thought about that scene.
Yeah, so I mean, this is so a little bit more context as well. So Mel Gibson, obviously persona non grata from Hollywood for anti-Semitic remarks and racist opinions, plays a jaded, grizzled, racist guy who's been run out of his organization through accusations of racism, essentially, or of racial abuse of someone. So even though Zahler said that he, and I'm inclined to believe him, that he wrote the part unedited and gave it to Gibson. I think possibly he even said he didn't have Gibson in mind specifically when he wrote it, which, fair enough. I mean, I'm willing to believe it. The fact that Vince Vaughn is also, I think, a conservative as well, probably provides a little bit more fuel to that fire of casting. So there's a scene after the two of them, they beat this Mexican drug dealer, and then they sort of abuse his girlfriend, who's naked and buxom and in the shower, and they pretend not to understand her and sort of look at her naked and do the kind of low-level shitty abuses of power which cops are notorious for, and there is clearly a racial motivation to that. When they're called into the office, there's basically a sort of a paragraph speech by the police captain, right, who basically says something along the lines of, "Oh well, these days everything is racist. You can't order a box of Kit Kats without someone saying that you're a monster, and the world's gone to the dogs, and it used to be easier when we could all just be racist together." I mean, sure. It's a speech that, even if you think it comes authentically from that character's feelings and motivations, is one of the more kind of didactic bits of dialogue that we've seen. Although actually, interestingly, Jake, in Bone Tomahawk also, characters make speeches about their conception of reality, which seem to fit Zahler's conception of reality, saying stuff like, the frontier is a terrible place and violent people make it worse, and there is a need for violent men to right the wrongs of the world. But sure. To go back to the racism speech, it is a on-the-nose speech that I'm sure had beer-drinking chuds across America, at least a few of them, raising their Bud Light in happiness to the TV as they watched Mel Gibson sort of succeed in his racial, in his racial abuse, and then, for the rest of the movie. So I think it was probably the most close to the fire that Zahler stood in terms of what he's allowed his characters to say. His response, of course, is, "My characters are not me." So I'd be interested to see what your take on that is.
Yeah, and I think the scene works on another level as well, which is, do you know the actor playing the police captain, who that is?
No.
So that's Don Johnson, who's also in Born on 7/99, who was one of the stars of Miami Vice. So it's Gibson and Don Johnson, two faded stars of like 80s buddy cop series, basically stuck in this like drab corporate office, going through the motions of this like, getting called into the headmaster's office or into your boss's office and getting this like, this very kind of like boring, like one note where no one seems particularly bothered, but it's just kind of, the whole scene is quite depressing. And so I think, you could see it, and this is kind of part of where Gibson's casting comes in is it's like a reflection on the kind of like this like faded machismo of like of the police force, and how we used to make these kind of films which celebrated the police, and now the police is like a sort of it's a taboo subject, and obviously like this is not a worldview which aligns with my own, but there's something interesting there, something provocative there, and I think at least he's showing you that like these are the kind of conversations which people in the police probably are having. They are justifying their behavior, and on some level they do see themselves probably as people like like they're in Miami Vice, or like they're in Lethal Weapon and stuff. Those are the things which they grew up kind of wanting to be, and now they're faced with this kind of like reality where that kind of thing isn't popular anymore.
Yeah. Yeah, that's very true. And having, for example, like a sexualized, Mexican or Asian or black woman naked in the shower, that's such a kind of classic trope that you might see in a sort of 80s action film, right? The kind of scene where the naked girlfriend is there and the cops are like, should we tell her to put some clothes on? Probably not, and that would be played for laughs at that time. And now it's played for a kind of uncomfortable, skin-crawling, racial, sexual moment. Although, it's fundamentally the same event, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think I've seen reviews of the film where they're like, "This scene is blatantly played for laughs," and it's like, I don't really think it is at all. I think it's so sleazy and uncomfortable, and it's
I'm trying to like
so depressing. Watching these two old guys, like these old guys sort of go through the motion of doing this like banter, and I think that one thing which I really like about Zahler's films is how drab the aesthetic of it all is. He doesn't even have like, so for example, a lot of people criticize the style of Bone Tomahawk as being incongruous because it's shot on this like really like crap looking digital, and people would expect that to have that more kind of like the Tarantino Rodriguez like grindhouse look, where it's like the old kind of like beaten up film stock and it has like a bit more of like texture to it.
Yeah,
but Zahler kind of really leans into making the films look like just cheap and unpleasant. There is this kind of like bland, like almost like corporate or like drained look to Dragged Across Concrete, which I think really comes out in one scene which I wanted to get your opinion on actually, which was the scene with the woman leaving her child behind so she can go to work.
Yeah, so I'm glad you mentioned that. So that I thought was a really interesting scene for a number of reasons. So just to explain, so the two African American gentlemen are on their way to they are supporting the European evil 80s baddies in their way to rob a bank, which is a very long scene, a very drawn out scene, a very tense scene. And one of the things I like about Zahler's movies is that the violence comes with such visceral unpredictability that no one is safe, and main characters are regularly mutilated or blown to pieces in the middle. There's absolutely no guarantee that anyone is going to get away at any time, and a lot of the time your heart is in your mouth waiting for something to go wrong. Now, what Zahler does is he introduces the scene through this woman. I can't remember the name of the actress, Jake. She's in a bunch of his movies, right?
Jennifer Carpenter.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, and she has a wonderful ability to sort of display barely repressed madness and kind of hysteria, like just behind her eyes. And she goes to the house of her presumably ex-boyfriend, husband, begs to see the baby, and he basically says, "You have to go back to your work at your job at the bank. You need to pay for the baby food. Please go. You can see the baby for a second." And she's so on edge. She returns. There's this sort of enormous performative, "Oh, welcome back to work. We're so happy to have you back as the bank apparatus. Like, we've made cupcakes or something for you." And it's already long and painful. You're kind of like, who the hell are these people? What's going on? It's interrupted by the arrival of the extremely professional, who are I think they're quite wonderful actually. The kind of the nihilists from The Big Lebowski, except they've recorded their messages, and their threats of violence. They're wonderfully terrifying, and truly everyone is so intelligent in his movies about how they make their strategic decisions. It's really impressive. It's not a bunch of dum-dums running around with each other. Everyone is very 2 steps ahead of each other, and it's quite gripping and quite thrilling. But they arrive, they make their threats. She has the chance to send an email to the police. She decides not to do it. She lunges to try and stop her colleague doing it, and is machine gunned brutally by executed essentially. Cries out to help her baby, and then is executed on the floor by the European terrorists, who I believe then also what's the word I'm looking for? Emasculate, cut off the genitals of the bank manager as well in an additional kind of Zahler.
They castrate Fred Mellerman. Yeah,
indeed.
Which it's cartoonish for sure in some ways, but I think that And I think this is an interesting example because it's in a way my favorite scene in the film because it's so formally audacious and so unlike anything I've ever seen before. And yet also perhaps a scene where like you can really project a kind of very reactionary, message into it because essentially it's about the unnatural separation of women from their children to force women to go to work. And, it's showing you this, this completely lifeless corporate space. And, we should also add that the film takes place in Bulwark, which is a fictional kind of Anywheresville American town. So it's this, this anonymous workplace in this made up town. There's no kind of identifying features of it. And, I think what Zahler was kind of saying is like, look, in America, you can, you go to work in these anonymous places, you leave your family to go and do it because you're told that's what you have to do. But there, there's a chance that one day some maniac with an assault rifle is going to come to work and cut you in half. And that's the reality of like, living in America in one day, which is, a very, very paranoid, reactionary, understanding of modern America. But it's captured in such a sort of like visceral and like shocking way. And it really, really has stuck with me. And rewatching it, like it still had a lot of power. And it shows that, Zahler is, he's audacious and he's experimental because like the way that the scene is set up is the camera is completely still and then you just see these figures just appear in the background in a way that is really, really frightening, in a way that would be different if it was like if the scene was all sort of shot like very like shadowy and like expressionistic and like noirish, then like these figures would look in some way like they belonged. But it's this really, really bright space and these figures in black just appear in a way that is really, really chilling. And I think that Zahler is doing a lot of kind of like formal things, which I think are almost more interesting than his more kind of blatant political and like antagonistic aspects.
I think that's a great point, and I think that also there's generally a lack of what's the word I'm looking for? Is it exegetic or the music is? I think there's no music in that scene. I think it's also worth mentioning that I think Zahler. My understanding is for Dragged Across Concrete, he wrote the music, then convinced the OJs to cover it. Is that right? Because he's a composer.
I think
himself.
Essentially, yeah.
But
he also sings one of the songs.
Yeah.
There's a scene in the diner. Can you hear me?
Oh. Yeah, go on.
There's a scene in the diner where there's like an awful pop song playing on the radio, and then they're like, "Oh, is this a boy or a girl singing?" And it's a sort of classic, classic bit of like Zahler dialogue. But that's Zahler singing the song because he said he didn't want the OJs to sing it and then be insulted by the characters.
That's funny. That's funny.
Sweet in a weird way, but.
But I think that's also funny because there's a few scenes in those movies of people like there's some in Cell Block 99 where he's driving in the car and there's some kind of anodyne saccharine like pop song like "Oh baby, won't you let me be in your car?" And he suddenly just starts smashing his hand and destroys the cassette. So if we're looking for kind of commentary on contemporary American society, which by the way, what you said before about the whole women workplace thing, that never occurred to me. It's really interesting. There also seems to be this commentary about the to put it bluntly, the horror of contemporary American society. And in Dragged Across Concrete, you're shown the projects and you're shown the kind of crack addicted or heroin addicted pimping of his character's mother and the horror of that. But the next people they live in the financial district and she goes to work at a bank and like she's treated with like love and aplomb. And actually there's a lot of scenes in the movie where they go to kind of luxury shops to buy a ring and stuff, and they meet all these kind of high level international criminals. And in a way it's just sort of saying like everything from the top to the bottom is horrible. It's horrible and rotten. It's rotten. And it's just rotten to the core. And these people are all criminals. Or I mean, one word I used in my notes to Jake, which I think really stuck out for me, is Manichean. In other words, that he seems to have a vision, especially in Bone Tomahawk most clearly, of a sort of rotten world, a despoiled world, a kind of Gnostic world. But there are these kind of forces of like of black and white and good and evil that seem to control the world and seem to kind of manipulate people. In Bone Tomahawk, it's very one-on-one, although that the four cowboys are themselves all kinds of problematic people and sort of drug addicts and rapists and all kinds of other things. They have this kind of horrific force that's so much worse than them that they oppose it. And then in Dragged Across Concrete, you have four fucked up people committing crimes, robbing people, but at least they have the nihilists as a kind of like bottom the nihilists who are willing to dismember, a man to remove the key from his stomach, and that allows Zahler's films a kind of moral hierarchy that forces you to sort of be willing to identify with people who are not particularly good people,
Yeah, I mean, I think that the thing with Bone Tomahawk, for example, is, he does seem to sort of be actively trying to sort of create this no heroes kind of like worldview. I think you were talking about it in terms of like Blood Meridian and making this kind of like revisionist Western where it's like, getting rid of the myth that there were sort of heroes on the frontier. But then, you do have a sort of character like the Patrick Wilson character whose wife has been kidnapped, who is basically not really given any kind of edges to speak of. Which I think is something that, even I would argue that like in Zahler's worldview, that the character in Brawl and Cell 99 is perhaps, he's not like a completely virtuous character, but like they stack the deck against him so much that you'll root for him to do, pretty much anything.
And this is
and I think that. Sorry, carry on. No,
this is perhaps the reading that, if you believe that, let's call them, chuds, reactionaries, conservatives, MAGA people across the world of all stripes and varieties, this is perhaps the reading that is the most gives the most credence to this criticism. These are movies about white or working class American people who have the odds so stacked against them by a corrupt, financially screwed up society that their violence and their skill and their drive and their sense of duty permits them to take what they want and to rebuild the world into a fairer way to them, and that is generally encouraged in some way or endorsed by the movies. Does that make sense to you?
Sure. I think that the big thing with Brawl and Cell 99 is that, there is a lot of kind of plot to basically justify. So there's a lot of justification given to just justify the plot, which is this guy basically just wrecking his way through a prison full of minorities and doing this sort of, and just, scraping people's faces off and just smashing bones, or just like, and but it's like, it's because
nice people sometimes, people who don't seem too awful,
Yeah. Like, as soon as the guard started being nice to him, I was like, okay, well, this guy's but and it's funny because it's like, Zahler also is kind of like racist in like sort of unusual ways, like the big fuss made about the fact that the abortion doctor is Korean, like they keep
not an
like,
abortion doctor. Exactly, but surely the most notable thing about him is that he fucks with unaborted fetuses, not that he's of Korean descent, and yet it somehow is constantly mentioned that he's Korean. Right. Yeah,
exactly. So it's like, and like, I think in that sense, I don't know if you saw this thing about Brawl and Cell 99 earning it was 4.5 swastikas out of 5 on some like alt-right review site, which, like, make of that what you will. I mean, I like I'm sure that the level of criticism is not at a particularly high level, but I think that what Zahler's films do is, although I don't think that Zahler is expressing a particular value system through his films, he leaves you enough room to project, which allows them to be embraced by a certain group of people. Because if you are surveying your sort of Netflix queue as a sort of conservative or whatever, then really there are going to be a very slim number of films released nowadays which are going to in any way kind of support your viewpoint. I mean, if you are looking for films which are patriotic, then you might have more chance. But because example, like, the Peter Berg, Mark Wahlberg kind of recent films, they might sort of suit you. There's a lot of kind of military propaganda or whatever that still gets released, like Six Underground or whatever. But if you want the particularly kind of like black-pilled right-wing viewpoint, then Zahler's films do reflect that, which I think is why that they have come to the fore, in the Trump era, which has reflected a more kind of like nihilistic right-wing outlook than a more kind of jingoistic one. Because I think the Dragged Across Concrete, the controversy around it was framed as if it was like a Blue Lives Matter film.
Right.
But that is absolutely not what the film is. And it was funny. I was imagining, because they were saying that the films do a good trade in like Walmart and like the bargain bins.
Yeah, I saw that.
And I was imagining like, you know, you're in Walmart, you pick up Drive Across Concrete. You know, at the end of the film is Tory Kittle's towing Mel Gibson, and the song playing on the radio is called "Don't Close the Drive-In," and it's like this really like mournful like elegy for America. And just thinking like, that's really what I thought this.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly. There are bits of those films that could get you fired up if you did have that. But then, yes, absolutely. It just seems that they are because he's obviously a man who takes influence from so much of this stuff. And films used to be racist. I mean, that's maybe the key to some of this, is that the structure of movies used to be like an 80s action movie, a white guy, possibly with a black sidekick, you know, battling their way through Russians, Arabs, you know, whatever kind of ethnic group was big that particular time, possibly sleeping with a woman of, you know, some other country's descent, and played for laughs and with a kind of force of moral rectitude that was unquestioned until we got to like the 90s, the early 80s or something. And so Zahler's hereticism is his refusal to engage in the games of I don't want to say identity politics, his refusal to turn away from that kind of classic format of movie making, and his insistence on doing it. And perhaps I think you will agree with me that what makes this conversation worthwhile and interesting is that the movies are good. Because if they were not good, we would just be talking about, well, we wouldn't be talking about it. We'd be talking about a reactionary director making wish fulfillment fantasy power for right-wing white chuds, right?
Sure. I think this is something which I find, surprising about Zahler's films, is that it's quite hard to actually find a sort of really negative review of them, because there are a few of them scattered around, but they're not by like major critics and major publications. And I think that what this shows is that, you know, critics, you know, do like Zahler because he makes provocative films, and he's obviously an auteur, and you know, it's a singular vision. There's formal innovation. You know, they're provocative. There are problematic elements, but like critics love, I think, you know, passing kind of the art from the artist, and like, you know, being able to kind of like examine these films as a sort of single entity. And you know, yeah, they are well received, and it's like I don't really feel like the alt-right, who are this kind of like imagined audience for these films, like I don't know if they particularly care about films even. Like if you look at something like the Dan Crenshaw political ads, I think that speaks much more to the cultural diet of the modern kind of like young right winger, which is just memes and like Marvel movies and stuff. And like, you know, Zahler's films, like, you know, they're throwbacks to people like, you know, like Walter Hill, Sam Peckinpah, Don Siegel, and people like that. And, you know, I don't know if like the sort of like average kind of, like MAGA guy or whatever is really, you know, engaged in kind of like film history in the same way that like Zahler or the critics who like his work are.
It would be interesting to think about. I mean, for me, I was thinking about Harry Brown, which is an English movie about a kind of Michael Caine, old in the tooth Michael Caine, ex-serviceman who like chavs throw dog shit at his house door or something. He sort of gets his trusty kind of rifle from World War II, and just goes and murders a bunch of working class people, kind of Captain Tom rampage, while being like, you know, delivering insight. It's a very strange movie. That, and also Gran Torino as well, which is a movie about a kind of grumpy white man who I think it's a Come Town bit that Nick made, where he said that, you know, 100% the first draft of the script to Gran Torino, it was him against a bunch of black guys, and the guy was like, they can't be black, please make them Hmong or something, so we can make this movie. A movie about the avenging of racial injustice, which you know, and those are perhaps movies that seem to have a more kind of easy read to that kind of audience. Whereas as you say, I mean, I don't think it's fair to say these movies are made for or particularly consumed by the alt-right.
Yeah, it's interesting that you bring up Eastwood, because this was something which I kind of wanted to tease out a little bit, which is perhaps why Zahler's films have been embraced you know, by critics on kind of both sides, or, you know, viewers really on both sides of the political spectrum. Because if you look at the films which have come out like during the Trump era, I mean, like, what is The Shape of Water like really saying about, you know, the sort of political situation in America? I mean, it's this kind of like maudlin like love story, or a film like Knives Out is this kind of like, you know, like very like Reddit comedy or whatever. Whereas Zahler's films have at least offered a more kind of like frank grappling with like post-recession America, with like the ugly racial politics of America. And similarly, Eastwood like in 2016 made American Sniper, which is a film which is like constantly at war with itself, with with Eastwood's desire to kind of valorize American soldiers, while also grappling with the reality that Chris Carr was this like hideous like Terminator, this like Frankenstein's monster created by the US military, who was just unleashed in Iraq and just became like a killing machine. And then over the last few years he has really been on a bit of a journey culminating in Richard Jewell, which is one of the most nuanced and like interesting looks at modern America that like I've really seen from any director. And I think what's interesting is that the liberal Hollywood mode of making films about these issues and stuff is very like saccharine and very sentimental. Whereas I think that people like Clint and Zahler, who have a slightly more kind of like anthropological interest in like human behavior, have kind of come out with the people making some of the more interesting films about modern America, which I don't really know what that says, but I think what it does show is that Hollywood is not really up to the challenge at the moment of confronting these issues and making kind of complex films.
Well, I you know what that made me think of, Jake, is the movie Black Panther, which maybe had a chance to in a mainstream setting to confront some of the incredibly complex and fraught problems of race relations in America, and chose instead to, I think, really flee to a pure fantasy of caricatures of that wasn't a movie that dealt with the complexities of the African American condition in the modern day America, and maybe it doesn't have to be. But for people who are looking for movies that give them something real to grab onto and characters that they can relate to, positively or negatively, their mainstream Hollywood is failing to provide the meat that people need to engage with these complex questions. And Zahler's movies do seem to be doing that. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not saying that like Zahler is like the most like kind of nuanced prophet on this stuff, but
yeah,
I think that just in terms of whether you like the films or not, the process of holding a mirror up to the ugliness in America is something which is interesting and which sparks debate. And I think that's something which critics are respond to, because even the negative reviews of Zahler's films and stuff, like it opens up a conversation about some things which I'm not sure you're going to get if you go and watch Jojo Rabbit, for example.
Right.
And so that's kind of how I feel about Zahler's work, really, is whether or not I agree with the worldview that's on display. There is at least an attempt at kind of confronting some kind of form of reality, and a lot of it is complicated and difficult and ugly.
Yes, exactly. But it might be the fact that at the moment the situation is so incredibly ugly that means that a director like Zahler is the only one who's going to have a chance of sort of talking about this. Because how are Marvel movies, even though something like, I don't know, like these Captain America movies, I think maybe try and talk about loyalty and patriotism. I don't want to get drawn too far into this. The current situation in America is so dark. I mean, these are movies about working class disenfranchisement and unemployment, about the prison industrial military complex, about police abuse and violence, about gun culture, and about, as you say, even about stuff like women in the workforce, which skipped me by the first time. But what issues would America want to talk about less? And kind of isn't it good that someone is, in his own auteurish way, making those movies?
I mean, I think this is a big one for me with Zahler, was that the way that the films were described to me as these kind of like reactionary fantasies, and then especially Born in Suburban 99, and like I think you were saying it was like Kafkaesque in the way that it shows you the like this hideous like bureaucracy of the prison system. And what I like about Born in Suburban 99 is it peels back the layers of respectability of the American prison system to show you kind of like what's really underneath it all, which is just this like dumping ground where it's like where people are just locked away and forgotten about, and it's like obviously presented in a very Baroque way, but it's memorable, and then like the visceral brutality means that these ideas stick with you. I think in a way that there's sort of like, for example, I don't hate Adam McKay's recent films, Vice and The Big Short, but the condescension in it of being like, look, we know that you're too dumb to understand this, so look, here's a smoke show in a bath or whatever to explain it to you. It's so patronizing. And I think that I like in some ways Zahler's more kind of like shoot from the hip, let's make a ugly, brutal film to reflect, what's kind of really going on in America. I think that in some ways does work for me a bit more.
Absolutely. Cool. All right. I mean, I think that's all really good. And I'd like to thank you for introducing me to Zahler, whose Wikipedia page is really a really fascinating read. I mean, the man has written novels, he has metal albums, he has movies, he has sitcom scripts. I think his net project is I think it's an adaptation of a children's book or something like that he wrote. So a real turn away from what he's been doing before, but an obviously incredibly talented and prolific man. So yeah, thank you very much for introducing me to the movies. And yeah, go on.
There was one more thing which I think I wanted to just discuss briefly, which was the studio which funds Zahler's work and the role that they've had in maybe proliferating some of this stuff. Because there's this Texas-based studio, and it's founded by this guy called Dallas Sommier, who both of his parents were murdered on separate occasions. And he gave this insane speech basically where he was talking about how the experience of that and of looking his parents' killers in the eyes in the courtroom and stuff reflected the kind of films which he wants to make. And they have basically gotten hot water for focusing on films like Zahler's and another film called Standoff at Sparrow Creek, which is another kind of like neo-noir about a American militia hiding out after a shooting at a police funeral. And he just produced the film Run, Hide, Fight, which is it's basically about a mass shooting at a school and about the kids who decide that they're going to fight back because they know how to use guns. And so, Zahler's interesting because he sold scripts to sort of quote unquote like legitimate studios like Warner Brothers and stuff in the past, but he has ended up in bed basically with these people who are the ones who are financing it. So, although Zahler can sort of throw his hands up in the air and sort of try and claim that the films sort of speak for themselves, the people who are sort of putting these films out, I think, are perhaps more cannily targeting the American right than Zahler is himself. But yeah, that was one final thing on the studio. But yeah,
no, that's good. I think that's an interesting thing to point out. Cool, great. Well, I think it's been really interesting, and I hope people can see sort of why we've linked this to the Heretics theme and sort of the questions it raises, and rather than going for something kind of horrifically obvious, maybe talk about Mel Gibson specifically, there's just a number of elements in this that I think are about what heresy is, which is deviation from the orthodox and doing what is not allowed in inverted commas, and doing it in a way, in Zahler's case, with such aplomb and undeniable skill, and I think subtlety, that it forces me and you to have this kind of in-depth conversation and makes it very hard for people to write the kind of negative lambasting reviews that perhaps they would like to have written, where they say this is just a piece of reactionary art of no value. He's successfully immured himself from that kind of direct criticism, and I think it's been a really good example of sort of how hereticism can sort of exist, and maybe says a fair amount as much about the American Hollywood system as it does about Zahler and his movies as well, that he is put into a camp with people who might just be, neo-Nazis and stuff, rather than folded into the mainstream as a talented filmmaker.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think one thing that which sticks out to me is in the Guardian review by sort of Peter Bradshaw, who's the kind of like ultimate like Guardian stuff shirt, describing Dragged Across Concrete as horribly compelling, which is, I think, it says a lot about the way people sort of like, there's a sort of like, you've got to hand it to him mentality with Zahler, which I find interesting. And, I think maybe, I'm not saying that we need sort of more films like Dragged Across Concrete, but I think it's definitely, provokes some interesting conversations. Like, I'm not going to be saying like, this is the film we need right now or anything like that. But if it fulfills a sort of interesting role, and I would definitely be interested to see what Zahler does next, especially as he says it's a sci-fi film about wonder and imagination. So can only imagine what that means.
Okay, well, if there's not at least some dismemberment in it, I'll be asking for my money back at this point.
Yeah.
Great, Jake. Is there anything else you'd like to say about Zahler, about Heretics and stuff like that before we start wrapping things up?
No, I think that's it. Follow at Deeper Movies on Instagram. Got some big announcements coming up soon. But yeah, besides that, that's it for me. Thanks for having me on.
Thanks for watching the films. Yeah, no, my pleasure. Yeah, so I mean, just very quickly. So Jake is a very talented film writer and a bit of a film genius buff when it comes to that. So I think Deeper into Movies is currently his the frontier on which he is writing what the world needs to read about movies, along with his first foray into an audio format, which has been, I think, really, really, really fun. So follow Deeper into Movies. Would people still want to check out Fold Films? Your previous? Do you want to talk about that quickly?
Yeah. So at one point I was running my own kind of underground film night, Fold. But yeah, since I started working with Deeper into Movies, I've had to stop doing that. But the website is still live, foldfilms.uk. There's some interesting writing on there. Have a look if you're interested. And feel free to get in touch if you want to be involved in any of that kind of stuff. I'll happily speak to you.
Jake, thank you very much.
Yeah,
so for everyone else out there listening, we're really glad to be back. There will be more Heretics content live. If you're hearing this right now, it means we figured out the technology to do remote Heretics, which is something I was against at the start. But unfortunately, there's some pesky bug going around at the moment and people don't want to come over to my house. And so this is perhaps the wave of the future. So hopefully we'll have more special edition Heretics stuff like this coming up, as well as standard episodes with Oxford academics and stuff like that. So I hope you've enjoyed this little slice of hereticism. I strongly encourage you to go watch the movies of Zahler. I would probably say to start with Bone Tomahawk. That was probably my favorite of the three, but all three are good. Perhaps for me, Cellbot 99 was a little bit more of a, what would I say? It probably, the minutes felt a little bit longer watching that movie than some of the others. But he's certainly Dragged Across Concrete and Bone Tomahawk I would highly recommend. And stay connected. Guys, please follow us on Instagram is the best way, at Heretics Show. I'll be linking the show on here. You can subscribe through the RSS feed linked on the website. I'll be putting a link to that as well. We should be on iTunes. I'm trying to find the easiest way to engage with it. And hopefully we'll have some video clips from this show as well live on YouTube. So please expect more content coming up. And please tell us what you thought of the show. More of this, less of that. You know, which one of us has better hair? Kind of, this is the questions that we need to know. So please bring it to us. And I'd just like to thank Jake. Thank you so much for all your effort. Really, really enjoyed the conversation. And thank you for coming on.
Yeah, good stuff. All right, mate.
Cool. Cheers, guys. All right. Stay safe out there. Stay heretical. And we'll wrap it up now. Goodbye, everyone. Bye.
The ground shakes. Sleepers are awakened. The tattoo of their approach. Relics fall from the wall. The gates burst. The ancient centuries stride. Shadows spread as they advance. March onward. Attack the fortress. Obliterate. Swing the iron hammers against the wall. The tall ones stride through conquered lands. Advance! 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 The walls crack. Birds take to the air. Geysers signal